Hello there, this is Coden,
And this is Cassia.
and welcome to the Evan Hawk, a podcast where we discuss Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic, as well as everything Star Wars. Today, we will discuss Star Wars Squadrons, Swoop bikes, and KOTOR, and discuss how racing inspired a galaxy. Spoiler alert for those that need it for the Knights of the Old Republic series and the Star Wars films and TV shows. This is episode 26, and this is where the fun begins. So we'll get kick-started with our first topic where we're going to cover our listener questions. Our first one comes from ironic.designs, and they had asked, what were your reactions to playing KOTOR 2 start to finish? Which path or crew did you take? Cassia, why don't you get us kick-started on that?
I first played KOTOR kind of right after Knights of the Old Republic 1, and it kind of just felt like a bit of a different game, and at the time I think that took a lot of people, it took them aback, because Knights of the Old Republic 1 is just kind of like your straightforward hero's journey, not too dark, but it still felt like an original trilogy story. Knights of the Old Republic 2, the game is just a whole lot more intense, and the writing is just a lot more philosophical. It's kind of like the difference between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. They're both great, but sometimes like tonally a bit different at times. I kind of knew that the game was a bit rushed. It was unfinished. I mean, there's been a lot of movement, like, that's restored some of the lost content. So I don't think like having lost content like helped the game's reception at the time. It seemed like people really kind of just preferred Knights of the Old Republic 1. But as time has gone on, people have come to really value Knights of the Old Republic 2. Like, that's how it is for me. Like, I love both of the games. I mean, that's why I'm kind of running, a Knights of the Old Republic podcast. But Knights of the Old Republic 2, I like the diversity of the worlds and the characters. There's a whole lot of characters in Knights of the Old Republic 2. Some of them are okay, but some of them are really good. I really liked Kreia. Like, Kreia is probably like in the top 3 or top 5 of my personal top Star Wars characters of all time. Vices Mar, I liked Bayodur. And then you have some old favorites like HK-47 and T3M4 actually kind of does stuff in this game. It was darker, and you could kind of feel that it was a bit of a rushed game, but with time and the restored content, I think it just shines. My favorite characters were usually to have with me as I did my missions, Kreia was solid, Bayodur, Vices, and Mira. I like them. And like basically all your crew can become Jedi or Sith. It always helps to have more Jedi. What about you, Coden?
Well, with these types of games, I tend to not really pick like a side. I tend to just kind of let my choices kind of dictate where I feel like I want my playthrough to go. And so when I pick a team, I tend to pick somebody who's really good with healing, and then I pick just another person that can help with taking out enemies. I prefer somebody who can take out lots of enemies at a time, but typically they're just doing the same types of attacks that I'm doing. And so that's kind of how I tend to set up my team. I haven't gotten far enough into KOTOR 2 to really get to that point. I don't know if I will, just with how my computer will play KOTOR 2, but that's definitely how I played the first KOTOR, was taking a look at the different strengths of the characters available and kind of picking those that kind of fit with the parameters that I prefer. So Ironic Dot Designs had another question for us, and they had asked thoughts on a what if animated series or film. For example, George Lucas's sequel stories in Clone Wars, styled by Filoni. What do you think, Cassia?
I've been thinking for a while that if they were going to do like I remember the comic series Infinities that had some different takes on episodes 4, 5, and 6. In 4, it's like what if Luke's torpedo going into the Death Star didn't go off, what would happen? What if Luke died in episode 5 in the weather, and then Leia would have ended up becoming the Jedi? Then in episode 6, what if like the thermal detonator accidentally went off earlier? After I watched the Disney Gallery The Mandalorian, where Dave Filoni was explaining the Duel of the Fates, like Qui-Gon would have been the father that Anakin needed, I would kind of like a what if comic or series or whatever, like exploring what would have happened if Qui-Gon would have trained Anakin, just kind of like seeing what would have happened in the prequel trilogy if that would have happened. Because I don't think Anakin would have been Darth Vader, and I think things would have looked a lot better for the galaxy.
Like what if Anakin let Mace Windu take care of Emperor Palpatine? That would have been just over. It's kind of the funny thing about the what if question is, I mean, honestly, unfortunately, we got this sequel trilogy instead of George Lucas's vision for sequels, and that's just kind of it. Like, it would be neat to see like an animated series, but it's just kind of like treading on top of what we got instead. So it's, as far as like, would we ever see it? Yeah, it would have to be something that's like way after its relevance.
Yeah, I mean, there was a comic adaptation done of George Lucas's, like one of the very first few drafts of the Star Wars. So it was kind of interesting to see like there was a character named Darth Vader, and he had like the Darth Vader pants, but he wasn't like a cyborg. And then characters named like Leia, Anakin, and Luke Starkiller, but they don't look like how we've seen them on film. And Han Solo is a green alien. Like I could maybe see like 30 years from now when George Lucas is just a pleasant memory, maybe those comics coming to light.
So our next question, Star Wars.Lores asks, if Leia was the Jedi in the original trilogy, how different do you think the events would have played out? It was important for Obi-Wan to watch over Luke. I guess he just assumed that he would be that mentor and figure to train Luke to be a Jedi. And so I think that their roles would have to completely reverse, where Leia was the one that lived with Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru on Tatooine, and Luke would have been the Prince of Alderaan. And so I think a lot of things could have been different. There's Leia would have been the kind of the farm girl of the Moisture Farms, and would that have actually played out? We don't, that's a great question. And then we would have seen Luke in more of a royal role. I don't know. That's kind of my thoughts on it. I was looking into why Leia was known as Princess Leia in the first place, and I had to get that reminder that though Bail Organa was a senator, his wife was actually the Queen of Alderaan, which was a new fact for me.
Because it depends where the twins go, how much like it would change the story. I think with Yoda and Obi-Wan, they didn't want to raise the kids because I think they kind of learned that people needed families and to kind of connect with how the regular people live. Like, attachment is a good thing and Jedi should care. So I think that was supposed to be like a correction that Obi-Wan and Yoda took, was that they didn't teach them, but they sent them to be raised by the Organas and the Larses.
One thing that also would have had to change is, so they, like, the initial assumption was that they needed to split the kids up because it would have left a smaller like force signature to split them up. And then what happened was that Bail Organa had volunteered to take Leia because him and his wife had always wanted a baby girl. Yoda's recommendation was to take Luke back to family, and that was kind of how the decision was made. So it would have had to play out that the Organas would have wanted an adopted son, and then they would have sent Leia over to Tatooine.
It would have been interesting. I would kind of want to see this alternate version of the Star Wars original trilogy where Leia was the Jedi. It would just be interesting to have Leia meet Han sooner on Tatooine, not in a prison, and just kind of see them rescue Luke and get off. And I just wonder, like, would Luke have been flying in that alternate universe, like on the Death Star run, and then Leia would have been watching? I don't know, but
would the drive to rescue Luke be the same as Luke's drive to rescue Leia? That's
yeah. I mean, Leia, like Luke was kind of like, oh, she's pretty, like I'm sold, But I don't know if Leia would be as impressed. I don't know. Leia seems a lot more like Anakin, a little bit kind of more hot-headed. Maybe it just would have been interesting to like kind of see her get stuff done her way, and if she would have seen the good in Darth Vader. So it's an interesting question. I really enjoyed that one.
With today's role discussions, like it could have worked. I think back in the 60s and 70s, like it was a different time, and it made sense that Luke was a farm boy. But like nowadays, why not? Lindsay O asked, "What do you want Lucasfilm to announce soon?" And we kind of covered this before we got our recordings kick-started, but I think it's about time for Disney or Lucasfilms to start teasing us about the Kenobi series with some visual aids, some trailers.
Yeah. My hypothesis after watching the Disney Gallery, The Mandalorian, is when they realized they needed to make script adjustments, they were already so far into the previs of Kenobi that to change the scripts, they kind of have to kind of cast off some of the work they've already done and like kind of get back up to the point where they can shoot it visually. And like with what's going on right now, I don't think any filming is happening at the moment, but it would be nice to get some more official news on the Kenobi series. But as for me, what I would want Lucasfilm to announce soon, after reading George Lucas: A Life by Brian J. Jones, I would have to say I want to hear something about Indiana Jones 5. Because George Lucas would be involved with that. Spielberg would be involved. They might get a new director, but everyone who was involved for the creation of Indiana Jones would be involved. So that'd be interesting for me.
Yeah, I haven't looked at anything about potential Indiana Jones 5. I think Harrison Ford's come out about it though and said that there is discussion in the air over it. So
yeah, he's game. So like everyone would be cool with it. So yeah.
All right. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll move on to our next topic. So our next topic, we're going to talk about Star Wars Squadrons that was announced here just recently. So this is a new EA PvP, PvE space combat game, and it takes place kind of post-Battle of Endor with the New Republic versus the Empire.
It feels like this game kind of takes us back to some of like the old trilogy roots and just kind of like some of the older type of games that LucasArts put out. Because those ones really kind of changed the game landscape, I think. So it'll be fun to see their take on the post-Return of the Jedi era.
Yeah, it kind of looks like the kind of like a revamped X-wing versus Tie Fighter style game. It's kind of interesting to follow, but there's some things the with EA as a whole that I think there's some hurdles to get past. But when we get more information, we'll be able to get more details on that. So it's kind of described as like refined Battlefront 2 dogs fight in space. Each side will get a choice of 4 different types of ships. So whether it's a bomber or fighter, interceptor or support.
Yeah, I've always kind of been a bomber personally. So, what kind of ship do you think you'll be flying?
I alternate between fighters and interceptors. If I'm feeling a little bit dangerous, I prefer the interceptors, but I do kind of like the more balanced setup of a fighter. What's neat
Yeah,
about this game is that it sounds like you'll be able to customize your ships a little bit, kind of fine tune them to a little bit more your style. So you kind of have, say, for example, you'll have the fighter as a frame, but as you play the game, you can kind of tweak certain things about the ship, like your firepower, your shields, your speed, things like that. And so, alongside of the cosmetics and things, so I am pretty interested to see kind of how you can customize and fine tune it. It's kind of like a Need for Speed racing game where you can take a car and kind of make some adjustments.
yeah. Personalization is always good, and it'll just be cool to see some people's different takes on some of those. I was gonna call them planes, probably just because I've been watching the Battle of Britain, the 1969 film that Lucas, he kind of watched it for reference before he even filmed Star Wars. He always, in every draft, he included a dog fight. There's always going to be a big fight, and he kind of mixed Dam Breakers and the Battle of Britain and emulated the shots, TIE Fighter X-Wing combat, and when you have them in the turrets of the Millennium Falcon. So I was just kind of watching that, but anyways, it'll be cool to see all the different ships flying around and how that goes.
Yeah, what's cool about this game is that it does come with full VR support, so you can play the entire game in VR. You can play the entire game outside of VR. It's just kind of your preference.
Yeah, I think the VR will be a cool way to experience the game. I never played Vader Immortal, but I did have that experience at the Void earlier this year playing Secrets of the Empire, and it kind of played around with the Vader Immortal lore. So it'll be cool to see that support in a game later this year. So there are a few different worlds confirmed for Star Wars Squadron. So there is Yavin Prime, which, like, is a gas giant, and its Yavin 4 was the classic Rebel base. And then I'm pronouncing this Esselis, but maybe it's something else, or maybe it's French, and everything's silent at the end. But that is a sector that's under Imperial control, and it's icy. So it'll be kind of fun to dodge some of the, like, I don't know, icebergs or ice comets in space. Then there's the Nadiri Dockyards. It's a hidden starship manufacturing facility. And then Sisubro, which is the 7th planet of the Chandrila system, and it's surrounded by remnants of salvaged Imperial ships. And then the one I think I'm most excited for is Galatan, and it reminds me of Paragus, the Paragus mining facility from the start of Knights of the Old Republic 2, because it's a remote moon that's been ripped apart and it's still molten. So visually, I think it's going to be the coolest. And then the Zavian Abyss, it's in the expansion region, and there's asteroids floating around that are kind of electrically charged. Which world are you most excited for?
I'm actually excited for this Zevian Abyss. This kind of reminds me of the nebula you fly through in Rogue Squadron 2 when you're escorting the Rebellion fleet. And so I'm kind of excited to kind of see this again.
I think it'll be a good one. And then I think, like, seeing Yavin Prime from a different angle will be cool as well.
Yeah, it kind of has a lot of like Bespin visuals, but But yeah, I liked like a lot of the promotion around the Yavin Prime where it had the Star Destroyer hiding in the clouds, and then kind of like
Yeah,
pops up. Yeah, that's
I used that in a post. It was just uh so Instagrammable.
yeah, like that's a really kind of cool idea where they use the gas to hide the signature of the Star Destroyer, and then it pops up as a surprise. And I'm assuming that that's some campaign footage, and that'll be kind of a cool little story beat there.
Yeah. I kind of think they're the maybe one of the reasons we're not seeing like a Clone Wars era kind of dogfight game is because there's just something about when you're fighting another human, you know, and it's not a droid in the other cockpit. Like it just the stakes feel greater. I think. I mean, there was like Jedi Starfighter that maybe we'll see something like that in the future, but this looks like an intriguing game, and I'm excited for October.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to our next topic: how racing inspired a galaxy.
So I think I was just kind of thinking about this because, as I mentioned, I had listened to George Lucas: A Life by Brian J. Jones, and just kind of seeing the Star Wars Squadron trailer kind of just was getting me thinking of like there's always dogfights, there's always going fast, you know? Because when we're talking about Knights of the Old Republic, we're talking about one of the branches off of Star Wars. So I think it's always good to kind of look at the roots of where Star Wars came from. So when George Lucas grew up, he grew up in Modesto. He was kind of a consummate underachiever growing up, and his grades suffered because he would just kind of stay out all night cruising around Modesto, the Strip, in California as a teenager. So when he was a teenager, just one thing was on his mind: cars. And he just liked going fast and traveling around searching for races or like girls to pick up, you know? Just the downside was like his grades were not where he needed to be to graduate. So just before his high school graduation, he'd been studying in the library, and then he's like, you know what? This is hopeless. I'm just gonna drive home. And he ended up getting in a serious car accident like 3 days before his high school graduation. And everyone thought he was going to die. Because everyone thought he was gonna die, they're like, here's your graduation like diploma. You passed. Like, sorry you're gonna die. But he recovered, and during this time, Lucas like thought deeply about his life. And before the accident, he intended to just become a race car driver. But like after the accident, his car was like a race. It was meant to keep him in, like I think it was like a race belt. That failed. It ejected him from the car, and if it would have stayed in place, he would have been trapped in his car when it like got crushed on a walnut tree. So he was kind of just thinking like, I kind of failed as like, you know, a driver, you know, and I could have died. So he's just kind of seeing like every day after that car accident as an extra day he'd been given to do something with his life. And he thought that he wanted to give education another chance. And that eventually led him to go into the School of Cinema at the University of Southern California. And I kind of don't know what the world of entertainment would look like if he'd continued to be aimless. And I just kind of can't consider like what would have happened like if Star Wars hadn't been invented. But yeah, he graduated film school, and his second film was American Graffiti. I actually saw it all the way through for the first time about a week ago, and it's kind of like an ode to like growing up in a small town in the 50s, early 60s and it's it's his love letter, I think, to cruising and racing. And one of the characters drives a yellow car, and its license plate is THX-138, kind of as an homage to Lucas's film THX-1138. And it ends with a race, and one of the cars, like, it blows up. And I kind of noticed the yellow car kind of carries over to Anakin's yellow vehicles, because his pod racer, his speeder in Attack of the Clones, in the car, well, not car chase, it's a speeder chase in Coruscant, and then his Jedi Starfighter, they're all yellow, and I think that's kind of like, it's a flashy color. I think that George Lucas's, like, race car that he kind of souped up as a kid was also yellow, so it's kind of an homage to that. So Anakin, Luke, and Han, they're kind of all very good pilots, and Anakin and Han especially kind of have that, like, cocky, like, I'm gonna do this, you know, and no one can stop me, I'm the best, you know. Luke's a little bit more humble, but I was kind of thinking how there's always a pilot, you know, and in the sequel trilogy you have Poe Dameron, and then even in, like, the branches of Star Wars in Knights of the Old Republic you have Carth Onasi, and then in Knights of the Old Republic 2 you have Atton Rand. There's always, like, fast and flashy ships, there's speeders, there's pod racing, there's everything. And because of George Lucas's connection, like, even if you look at his student films, he just understands, like, what it's like to be behind a car, and I think that's why people love the pod race scene so much, you know, and the Battle of Coruscant. What do you think, Coden?
Yeah, so something that I was researching earlier today when we're looking at kind of the yellow and things, is yellow is used in Star Wars in two different ways, and it's yellow or gold depending on kind of the surface. But Anakin's pod, his speeder, and his starfighter have those yellow details, and they're kind of used in two different ways. One is, I think George Lucas kind of uses that to show off kind of like who or where the main character is, because that's also present with Luke's X-Wing, where he flies red X-Wing, but there's yellow detail all over the place. Also used in a form of leadership, where the Star Wars, the Clone Wars, the battalion leader that's with Yoda has yellow paint. All the separatists, like command battle droids, have yellow paint. And then that kind of like fades with Revenge of the Sith, but there's a bunch of yellow paint kind of displaying the leadership until the Empire just kind of makes everything gray. And with the Rebellion, there's Gold Leader and Red Leader that also use a ton of yellow paint on their helmets, as well as Gold Leader has a bunch of gold detail on his Y-Wing. So just kind of like some interesting little details in Star Wars, which is kind of interesting.
I remember reading the Revenge of the Sith visual guide, and like next to Anakin's Jedi Starfighter, it said like Anakin may have chosen yellow to kind of tie back to his pod racing days, or it might have been to draw people's eyes in combat, and that is kind of an Anakin move, like to kind of want attention. So visually it helps you find where things are at on screen. It's not blue and it's not green, so it wouldn't get lost in the blue or green screen, but it's a good visual reminder of where things are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if you learn anything from this section, it's just always wear a seatbelt, don't speed, don't text and drive, and don't drive under the influence of anything. So just drive safe.
All right, well, let's take another quick break, and then we'll go to our last topic and close out the episode. right, so our final topic is swoop bikes in KOTOR 1. So, in tradition of Death Star trench runs, speeder chases, and pod racing, Knights of the Old Republic gives us some swoop racing. So Cassie, why don't you talk to us about that little sequence at the beginning of KOTOR?
Okay, so it's mostly a mini game you can play later on in the game, but to break Bastila out of when she's a prisoner on Terrace, you have to win a race to save her because she's the prize. So it's like putting the hidden Becks against the Volkers, and there may have been a souped up accelerator that kind of, is cheating technically involved in the race, and that's how Revan won, but it's also because Revan kind of had some force abilities that helped him win the race. So we'll talk more about kind of breaking Bastila out and more about Terrace and all the story there, different levels and the gangs in a future episode. But eventually you do get off Terrace and after you win that race. And you later can there's like a mini game on 2 of the different worlds you end up visiting on Tatooine and Manon. There's a swoop bike stored in the Ebon Hawk. It's a little bit of a different swoop bike than you see like in the prequels, but I mean that it kind of makes sense because it's 4,000 years before that.
It seems like they
The
were kind of
rules,
going more with the aesthetic of pod racers than when you're doing the race on Terrace. I think you're using more of a pod racer, but later you use swoop bikes if I remember KOTOR
yeah.
1 correctly.
I mean, technically it's a swoop bike on Terrace, on Tatooine and Manon. It just kind of like evokes kind of more of the look of the pod racer.
Yeah, because the swoop bike
So
is something that you see more like in Return of the Jedi, and like what Anakin uses on Tatooine when he's trying to rescue his mom.
yeah, they're not quite as advanced then, but it is a swoop bike. But yeah, the rules for the swoop bikes, as explained in Knights of the Old Republic, is you try not to crash. Pretty straightforward. There's debris and obstacles in the course, and you try to hit the accelerator panels on the track just to kind of go faster. And then if the engine gets too hot, you have to switch the gears. So later on Tatooine and Manon, you kind of have to pay to play. I mean, you can race for fun, but you don't earn anything from it. So you win some racing bonds if you win. So on Tatooine, there are 3 tiers of races. You race at Anchorhead, and you talk to Mata the Hutt, who arranges the races. And just kind of like when you're racing on Tatooine, it looks a lot like, I mean, like with 2003 graphics, but it reminds me a lot of like the pod racing scene in The Phantom Menace. Then on Manon, there's also 3 tiers of races. It's kind of cool visually because you get to go over water, like the surface of the water. You can see like Otto on one side and then some energy panels on another side. It's just pretty. Like if there were a movie, I would definitely want to see that. On Manon, there are 3 tiers to the race. You race in the Otto East region, and the person who arranges your races there is a Selkath named Tassilith, which is a fun name with no vowels whatsoever. And if you win, you end up getting some racing bonds, and it helps you gain experience points and some money, which can help you. What did you think about racing in KOTOR?
When I played KOTOR, I was pretty fresh off of Need for Speed Underground 2, and they're basically the same with kind of the shifting game where you're having to change lanes to avoid traffic cars and timing your shifting to keep your engine from overheating and blowing out. So like I was like really good at the swoop bike mini games. So I don't know. I found it a little easy, but it was kind of a fun change of pace, I thought. All right. So this has been Coden.
And this has been Cassia. And you can find us on Instagram at Ebon Hawk Podcast. And you can always click the link in the bio And there you can find where our podcast can be found. Our podcast can be found everywhere that Anchor podcasts are distributed at the Ebon Hawk, and we are always grateful for subscriptions, reviews, and shares.
And with that being said, we should be posting out an Instagram post on just the new iTunes data because we have officially moved our iTunes channel. So keep an eye out on Instagram for the correct links for that. And if you want to email us your comments and questions, you can do so at ebonhawkpodcast@gmail.com. You can also just send us a message on Instagram. I also have my own Instagram account just at Coden Bond. You can also find me at twitch.tv/CodenBond, streaming typically Thursday evenings when I do kick on Twitch, 6 to 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time.
Our intro and outro themes were composed by Alistair Scheuerman. He can be found at alistairsounds.wixsite.com/Alistair Sounds. And our transition music was composed by Christian Walker. He can be found at christianwalkermusic.com.
This has been episode 26 of the Ebon Hawk. May the force be with you. We'll be back soon. Bye for now.